Educational governance and accountability, and I do thank you for your presence. And I hope that we have more people watching online and planning to participate. Those of you who are here who would like to comment should see Melanie. She's outside and fill out speaker cards. And those of you who are watching online should email your comments to senator.liu.sen.ca.gov. So we will summarize your comments during the public comment section as we receive them, and your entire comment will be part of the hearing record. You can also find information and materials and PowerPoint presentations for this hearing on my website, and that's www.senate.ca.gov/LIU. Okay, so we're using technology to expand participation in the process among all the stakeholders as we examine ways to improve California K-12 public education governance system to make it more efficient and effective. Our goal is to create a system with greater transparency and accountability that meets the needs of state residents and the demand for an educated workforce in the 21st century. Everyone is invited to submit comments after the hearing, as well as the subcommittee's consideration. And I plan to introduce legislation implementing some of the recommendations that emerge from the hearings to provide a focus for further discussions next year. Without further ado, I will introduce Stephen Blake, formerly Executive Director, the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence 2007, and consultant to the Joint Committee to develop a master plan for education. He will summarize the major findings of the various studies on K-12 education governance, those study recommendations for local governance reform, and what legislation is needed to implement various study recommendations. So with that, Mr. Blake, I think we have a PowerPoint, correct?
We do.
Okay. I think I'll get out of the way.
Thank you, Senator Liu. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I note that all members of this subcommittee served at various points on the Joint Committee to develop a master plan for education. So it's a pleasure to be able to support you a bit again today. As you've indicated, I've been asked to summarize some of the findings of recent reports on governance reform. Those are the Master Plan for Education of 2002, Getting Down to Facts, a set of some 21 academic studies from 2007, the report of the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence 2007-2008, that was a little squishy, and the Little Hoover Commission report on education governance of 2008. I should note that these have been preceded by many other reports regarding and studies regarding education reform. Most recently, the Constitution Revision Commission in '96 and in '88, the Governor Duke Majan's Committee on Education Quality. But there are many prior to that. Almost every decade, this legislature has looked at something going all the way back to about 1920, when there was a special committee that said, if we don't do something, there are going to be real problems here with the State Board and Superintendent of Public Instruction situation. I wanted to start by just throwing this thought up here, that education governance should define the roles and responsibilities of all players in ways that will contribute to effective teaching and learning for every student in California. I note this because this isn't just some abstract study in efficiency or in roles or responsibilities. It really, it's something that's much more important, and it really does contribute to teaching and learning. Governance defines opportunities, it defines resources and where those resources are allocated, what is taught, what is tested, what values are transmitted to our students. And ultimately, the governance roles and authority that we allocate here at the state level really drives effectiveness fundamentally. Getting Down to Facts, as I indicated, was an academic study, and I say that in particular because they very specifically did not wish to make policy recommendations as we think of them here in the state legislature. So there was one particular study on governance by Professor Brewer down at USC called, oh my, I'm sorry, I'm lost among the 21 studies, the crazy quilt of governance. In this, the research team looked at 5 particular characteristics of effective governance, noting in particular that there's really no study that shows that there's a direct linkage between a particular model of governance and a particular level, changes in academic performance. But more importantly, it's about effective operation of the schools that can then contribute then to effective teaching and learning. So it should be stable. There should be advanced planning of policy and budgets. There should be no sudden shifts. Secondly, there should be accountability in our governance structures, very clear lines of authority, very clear pro and con consequences to actions that the different actors take. Should be innovative, flexible, and responsive, so we can look at what conditions occur in our local schools and respond to them in effective ways. It should be transparent. Everybody should be able to see who makes decisions and how. It should be simple and efficient. Ultimately, the report found that California fails on all 5 of these fronts, which I think is no surprise to anyone involved here. There's a lot of cross-fertilization, and for anybody who's familiar with these 4 reports, as you and your other committee members are, there's a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas and support of the work. In fact, the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence helped define some of the topics of some of the Getting Down to Facts studies. So as you look at the matrix that your staff provided for your first hearing, which I have used here in the this PowerPoint presentation, you'll see there's a lot of continuity among recommendations, and there's no surprise because we're all looking at the same research. We're all trying to be very practical and supportive of student learning. But I wanted to mention where the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence was coming from as they looked at making recommendations on finance, governance, personnel, and capacity building, if you will, because I think these are things that the committee should keep in mind as it pursues legislation to implement some of the recommendations or to choose even the recommendations that you want to implement. There should be constructive accountability to drive excellence. We need to be supportive of our educators and actually make sure that accountability promotes good and effective learning and prevents failure. Accountability as implemented here in California is pretty much a stick that comes down on educators, parents, students after failure. And it's quite the opposite of what I think in the abstract we would all think accountability ought to be. System should be outcomes driven. We need to align authority, incentives, accountability, and transparency to make sure that we're moving to the right outcomes. We need to promote continuous improvement. The system needs to learn itself, and so we need to constantly evaluate what is working, what is not, promote those things that are working and make them even better, get rid of those things that are not. That has to be data driven. Like everyone from that 1920 study that I described to you, we think that those nearest the students should make the educational decisions, not only because they know the students, but they know the conditions that those students are operating within and trying to learn within. And then finally, funding should actually support our educational goals. If we say, as a state, this is what we want students to know and be able to do, we ought to fund that and fund the particular processes that we think best get there. And that's going to be differentiated by student need. So as I noted, California has spent quite a bit of time developing standards-based accountability, but it has been much more of a stick than a carrot. It's also been just another program that we implemented here in California, as opposed to what research would tell us it ought to be and what other states have done and other countries have done as they've implemented accountability, which is to say it's the systemic foundation for our educational structure. So here in California, we still have all the compliance issues. Much of that is driven by categorical constraints, but there's a great deal of additional statute that tells an educator anywhere in the system exactly what they have to do, and it undermines their ability to be responsive to local need and to be flexible. And so educators still have to face all of those input controls, and they have the new output controls of accountability as we've implemented. So we tell an educator, here's what you need to accomplish. We put these constraints on them for all practical purposes, change them to the building and tell them to run a 100-yard dash. They don't get there. We fire them. We put another educator in place and put the same chains on them. No reason to expect that accountability is going to give us the kind of improvements that we want if we still have all of the same kind of process constraints. Actually, I've been asked to do a really fast recap here on state governance, which I know you discussed with Senator Alpert and State Board President Ted Mitchell and others at your last hearing. There are just too many decision makers in our process here, including even the electorate and the courts that have a lot of impact on what our schools are able to do. And there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of overlap of authority and responsibility. Recommendations, very quickly, from the Master Plan for Education. So all these recommendations, I should step back and say, were very much about delineating authority in different ways. Very clear delineation that, for the most part, gets rid of overlap and redundancy. Master Plan for Education said that we should have a cabinet-level secretary, if you will, to run the Department of Education and handle all the programmatic functions that we think of there. The State Board of Education should be primarily advisory, have a few limited roles. The Superintendent of Public Instruction should actually become something that many people would call an Inspector General. Make him or her responsible for accountability and eliminate the conflict of interest in being an entity that provides some of the programmatic elements to our schools and districts, and then is supposed to hold that system accountable. So, what are the chances that Superintendent O'Connell is going to give an F to the Department of Education for its role? Probably slim. Governor's Committee on Education Excellence, I think that it's be responsible for me to note that there were 6 people in that group affiliated with the master plan, myself included. Notwithstanding that, there are very good programmatic reasons why we came down on some of the very same sorts of recommendations for delineating authority, with the exception that the Superintendent of Public Instruction in the master plan was supposed to handle non-fiscal accountability. Governor's Committee on Education Excellence thought that all accountability would work well there. In addition, the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence thought that the state needs to be responsible for a regional inspection and support model that can support districts and support schools in improving, again, this constructive accountability, keep them from failing, but also build their capacity to succeed. Getting down to facts, I cited the 5 principles that they indicated should drive any of these governance decisions. The Little Hoover Commission, again, very similar recommendations. Also, they felt that federal and state accountability criteria should be linked. Obviously, that would mean, since we have no control over federal accountability criteria, that there should be a shift in the state. That creates some real conflicts because we've developed our own standards some time back, and so in addition to which, I'm not going to go so far as to suggest that No Child Left Behind is on the same path as Goals 2000, but we certainly see a very different focus right now. Even though the program's still in place, we see a great focus on other things in the federal government at this point. So you can alter those constitutional provisions that create the State Board and the superintendent. You can revise the statute to make the Superintendent of Public Instruction appointed. That's actually been recommended to this legislature 3 or 4 times over, since 1920 again. And though I should also note there's been no progress on that, including some attempted constitutional amendments that either didn't make it out of the legislature or failed on the ballot.
It does need vote of the people, doesn't it?
So in order to, no.
To be appointed?
No. The Superintendent of Public Instruction is created in the Constitution. It's actually statute that determines how the Superintendent of Public Instruction comes to have that position. You can revise statute to make State Board positions elected rather than appointed. Again, the State Board exists in the Constitution and has 2 functions and nothing else. You can redefine statutory duties of the board and the Superintendent of Public Instruction to reduce overlap. You could eliminate the Secretary of Education, and the Little Hoover Commission basically said, get rid of this secretary that currently exists in the ether, that is really just some redirected positions from the governor's OPR, and then created in statute as a cabinet-level education position. But I think fundamentally we can expect that a governor is going to have an education advisor. Certainly since the early 1900s, all governors have, and it's just under Pete Wilson that it was elevated to the status of a Secretary of Education. So I've been asked to focus today on two things. One is the local elements. I know you focused on state elements, state governance elements at your first hearing. Focus on some of the local and then talk more directly about the kinds of statute or budget items that would be needed to implement. So let me shift now to some of the local level. But actually, let me stop and ask if you or staff have any questions or comments.
It's fine. We can just proceed. All right.
Let's cover for a water break. So in county-level governance, you don't hear the same sort of criticism structurally, or you haven't over the last 20 years or so, about county-level governance that you hear about others. Interestingly, it's primarily sort of a catch-all agency. It sometimes serves the state as an operational agent. Sometimes it's providing services directly to students. Sometimes it's providing, on a contract basis, if you will, the services that some of its districts want or need. But there are some criticism about the conflict of interest that can be inherent, especially as counties have become principal agents of at least fiscal accountability in this state, to the extent that I'm saying to a district within my county that I have oversight over you, and also I happen to be offering these services. Would you be interested in them? There is some criticism of that, but it's mostly just that this hasn't been very well defined, and the counties have not been terribly well funded. I do recall about 20 years ago there was a group of moderate legislators from both parties that were questioning whether we should have county offices at all, and we've moved today to a point where certainly in terms of fiscal accountability, counties are one of the most respected, or that function as it's being carried out by counties is one of the most respected in the system that is before us.
Stephen, how are they established and these roles determined?
Again, so they are established, both county offices of education and county boards of education, distinct entities, are created in statute. Forgive me, created in the Constitution. And then all roles for counties, for both of these entities, are created in statute. But you do have 58 counties, county offices of education created in the Constitution. And so anything that you would want to do that changes that structure would have to be done in the Constitution, but anything regarding their duties is statutory or budget control language.
Can it differ from county to county?
Only insofar as many of them provide support as districts ask them for it. And then there are certain things that, so when we did reading reforms 10, 12 years ago, the state often uses 1, 2, 3 county offices as an agent to carry out some state-level function on its behalf. So the differences occur from those two things. But the overarching statutes apply to all 58. Here again, very similar recommendations across the 4 different reports of the last 8 years. The Master Plan for Education discussed providing county offices with resources that would allow them to support district and curriculum and professional development, strengthen those functions, and make them a little more uniform. Empower county offices of education to monitor educational quality, just as they were emerging very strongly 8 years ago, 7 years ago, as monitors of fiscal quality. And then the master plan recommended looking into consolidating county offices of education, just questioning whether it was necessary to have 58. Might 57 be better, or 10 be better, or again, this gets into the Constitution, which I understand is not in the interest of this committee, but that was an important recommendation of the Master Plan for Education, insofar as it looked at being more efficient and streamlining agencies across the board. Governor's Committee on Education Excellence. Again, being driven by constructive accountability, as the committee thought of it, wanted to provide 11 county offices of education, Los Angeles and the lead county in each of 10 regions, wanted to provide the authority and the resources to make them greater agents of technical support for districts. Again, promoting capacity in districts and preventing failure. Also, county offices of education, it was recommended by the Governor's Committee, should provide be the chief agents of our accountability interventions. So, progressive level of support for low-performing schools, with the fourth support for low-performing schools being an actual trustee takeover, if you will. And then finally, create the academic equivalent of FCMAT, an ACMAT that could monitor those that are consistently failing, those districts that are consistently failing, and make the hard interventions that are needed. Getting down to facts, again, we really have the principles underlying these kinds of changes. Little Hoover Commission, again, very similar recommendations about providing greater levels of service to districts and expanding their role as in oversight from just fiscal to the academic functions. So options for this committee, if you take a look at the principal recommendations. And I should note, we're dealing with hundreds of recommendations in these reports, and we're just trying here to focus on, highlight the ones that might make the greatest impact and be most possible for this committee to pursue. Create regional capacity, as I've described, where you're going to be supporting intervention, supporting districts and providing intervention when there is failure. The reason that this has been recommended by the three different entities, the Master Plan, the Governor's Committee, and the Little Hoover Commission, again, just goes back to that fundamental principle of local control, recognizing that local educators are the best situated to know the local students, the local circumstances or conditions, the local politics. You also have local relationships between these county offices and the local districts, and you just have stability there. So you can develop trust relationships and be there as partners, not as somebody coming in again with that stick, but really build the trust relationships that let local educators know they're here to help. It is also presumed by at least two of these entities that not all counties should perform the function, just recognizing very different levels of capacity between some counties that have a few thousand students and some that serve millions. Another recommendation, consolidate county offices of education into regions. This comes from the master plan and would take a constitutional amendment. And it does mean quite literally have fewer than the existing 58. The third is create this ACMAT team, similar to FCMAT, and use the tools such as FCMAT uses for reviewing and assisting districts, and have process measures in things like governance and leadership, curriculum instruction and assessment, professional development, human resources, data assessment and monitoring, parent and community involvement, fiscal operations. The legislature would actually define those, but those are distinct recommendations of the kinds of tools that an ACMAT should bring to bear to be the kind of intervention agent that would be effective on behalf of the state. Impose regional interventions, again, for those that are districts that are consistently failing, and depending on how severe the shortcomings of the districts are, some of the recommendations that came from these reports were have county oversight of a district improvement plan. Second phase, assign a date, a district assistance intervention team. County regional direct support of the districts, and then ultimately assigning a trustee. Finally, this is something that is not currently at a county level but could go to a county level. One of the recommendations, one of the options before you is to overhaul categorical program monitoring even further. It's something that right now is very much about monitoring process with compliance with processes. Do you have X number of books in your library? Move it to evaluating effectiveness of the program, and there again, when you think about the principle that I described in this first bullet, local educators, local people with those local relationships and local knowledge are probably in the best position to do that. So move categorical program monitoring from the State Department of Education to counties or to county regions. So moving to districts and schools. we see that schools are impeded from carrying out their responsibilities effectively under the current structure. There's just so many laws, regulations, budgetary constraints put on them, and lack of capacity building that even though we all say that we're about local control, or most do, in this system, we're really impeding our local educators. So I described, they still have all these process compliance requirements related to processes, even though under accountability we expect different changes in their results. We see that there is very little flexibility to adapt and meet specific student needs under the current system. Schools don't get the resources, support, and capacity building that they need. And if you sit back and look at how the State Department of Education is structured and funded, there's no reason to expect it. When you have again, we have over 100 categorical programs, state and federal, and most of the staff of the Department of Education come with those items. So here's $100 million for X and 3 staff to very specifically ensure compliance with the processes of Program X. So there's very little latitude in the staffing of the Department of Education, and yet certainly the last 2 superintendents have aggressively tried to free up some capacity and make that happen. But schools aren't receiving that kind of the support that they need right now. We have so many districts differentiated in so many different ways that we can't feel confident, and you may recall this, Senator, from the master plan process, we can't be confident that the entire at least 12 and perhaps 16, 17, 20-year educational experience of students is being promoted by the existing structures. So there is one of the poster child of the master plan criticism of local governance was a small town in Northern California with fewer than 5,000 students that has 6 districts, 3 of which have 150 or fewer students. Now there may be a need for 30 board members and 6 superintendents and the like, but it's hard to demonstrate how that community's kids are necessarily going to be best served by that structure. And one of the things as you read these educational studies, the costs of compliance with all this bureaucracy that we've built is really a very stringent strain on some of our local districts. Specific recommendations. Adopt unified districts throughout the state. Back in the late 60s, you had 3,000 school districts, and through some financial incentives, and again, financial incentives move people, we came down to the 1,000 that we complain about now. But you can get rid of that, the sort of situation I described in a particular community if you have this. And the idea behind this fundamentally is somebody having a board and a system that focuses on all 12 years of that student's experience. Don't just focus on the first 6 years, the next 3. And yes, the problems inherent in that are mitigated by our movement to standards now, as you have a more coherent educational program, but we can do more. You can promote local district sharing of operations, just basic cost efficiencies, where especially for the smallest districts. Very briefly, there was a constitutional amendment suggested by the Master Plan for Education of creating limited home rule or constitutionally protected local control, basically the equivalent for districts of a charter city or a charter county. I won't go into that any further, knowing that it's not an area you want to move into. Governor's Committee on Education Excellence, again, really focus on this structure of moving us to an accountability-based system, a genuine accountability-based system that is about performance, that has data and evaluation, that builds capacity, and empowers districts to meet their student need in accordance with state standards. Here at the local level, there was also a very strong recommendation from the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence that I'll talk a little bit more about later, to create school inspection systems, or a quality review is what it's called in New York. Come to that very shortly. To go in and analyze schools and see what their strengths and weaknesses are and work with them constructively to make improvements. Again, the principles of getting down to facts, strengthen local control, permit flexibility over their use of resources, and pursue those 5 benchmarks. Little Hoover Commission talked about developing benchmark assessment tools, somewhat similar to what the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence is saying, and let's move to this very different kind of output or outcomes-based structure. So your options for local governance based on these reports: greater statutory, regulatory, and budgetary empowerment of school districts and leadership to make decisions, bearing in mind that they must meet state standards for all their students. A second option that comes out of this is to implement categorical reform recommendations, which you're definitely going to get more local control if you have more flexibility. Now, this year's budget, along with the multi-billion-dollar cuts, unfortunately, did move forward on providing some greater flexibility, taking about 40 categoricals, frankly, most of the smaller ones, but some that are very politically charged, and allowed complete flexibility to districts in moving resources across any of those or into other programs completely out of those, and provided some significant flexibility for the first time on class size reduction, reducing the penalties, allowing for slightly larger class sizes. So that's a great start. It's definite progress. Would be, we have no control over the comprehensive circumstances of our economy right now, but obviously this would be much more effective in supporting districts if it were happening in better budgetary times. And one thing that this committee can do is to work with all of your colleagues in the legislature and with the governor to make sure that you keep this ethos of flexibility as resources return, that we don't just say, now we have those billions of dollars back, let's make sure that all 40 of those programs are implemented according to statutes going back to the 1940s even. There is further deregulation of the education code that can occur, and there's just so much contradictory and constraining statute. There are more than 100,000 sections to the education code. So I don't think we would question that at least one or two of those could be removed, and I think that most principals and superintendents would appreciate even that effort. And again, as I described earlier, you could unify more districts through, and it would be recommended that that be done through incentives to make that change, rather than trying to bring down a change upon districts against their will or interests. Further options at the local level: create this school inspection and support system that I began to describe. This began in Great Britain. It's been introduced in England, actually, within the United Kingdom. Wales has implemented it. It's occurring in other countries now. It's happening in New York and Rhode Island. These are supportive, constructive accountability models that train inspectors, that develop an inspection profile and goes into directly to schools. This is not a district function. It goes to schools and works with them very carefully to find out what their deficiencies are, what their strengths are, and to help improve teaching and learning. So it starts with a self-evaluation, and one of the most fascinating findings of these studies when the inspectors go in is how off-base educators can be with respect to their self-evaluation, starting with, I'm teaching to the standards. And so these inspectors actually do classroom observation, and they are able to sit down with a teacher later and say, you're not. Here's what you taught, even though you think that this is, even though you can say on the self-evaluation that you are teaching to those standards. So the school staff and the inspectors work very collaboratively with the findings to explore what their strengths and weaknesses are, to develop action plans. The inspectors bring expertise, and they stay there. They revisit those schools. But it's not just a report that is dropped on the principal's desk and they've run away. Those reports, in turn, can be used by the regional intervention process, can be used by the state to try to help promote the school improvements that we need, and to guide more effectively any interventions that may be needed where failure is consistent. These are rotating processes where the inspectors come to schools every few years. Those that do very well on their reviews, maybe every 6 or 7 years. Those that are having problems, maybe every 2 or 3 years. They review everything: planning, budgets, policies, personnel, results, classroom. As I said, they do classroom observation to make sure that budgetary decisions are actually reaching the education process in the classroom, if you will. They recommend the steps to be taken to the school, but also up to the district and the county. They make these reports public. Once any of these systems has been in place for about 2 or 3 years, and they can be sure that their inspectors across the board, I mean, you want all of your state inspectors to be evaluating things in pretty much an equivalent way. Once there's confidence in the consistency and validity of the system, you start actually making those reports public, and that helps to drive change. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there was a single recommendation about providing incentives to increase collaborative operations among districts. So this concludes the set of recommendations from the reports and some of the options before the committee on the local level. Let me stop for a moment and see if there is any question or comment that you might have before I move into the data that drives accountability. We're good? So all of this is about increasing accountability to support continuous improvement, to support improved education. Can't do any of that without data. And California currently does not have the kind of effective system that we need. There have been some very good studies on what it takes to provide, to have an effective, comprehensive information system that can really drive educational improvement. 10 characteristics are evident. We'll come to that in a couple of slides. We have 5 in California today and are working on 2 others. We also don't have the analytical capacity that can support working with that data. So if I just give you a raw report of 600 pages on a printout, how does that help you if you are management in a very large district with 100,000 students or more? We can't assume that you have that capacity. Many do, but we can't assume that all schools in the 1,007 districts have that. So it is necessary that that be built. And then, frankly, here in California, data and information that we do have is highly inaccessible. Whether you're a parent and you get the school accountability report card was developed under Prop 98 to help keep parents apprised of what's going on. The most recent review of that indicated that you needed a 14th grade or sophomore in college grade education to be able to actually follow what is going on the school accountability report card. Many, many layers, and then frankly, a lot of things are done on the school, have been legislatively added, statutorily added to the accountability report card because you can do things for free since it's technically a voluntary process. So that's been very problematic and needs some attention. What's the data system about, or what should it be about? Informing decisions, evaluating program effectiveness. What works, what doesn't. Let's get rid of the things that don't or repair them. Let's really bolster those things that are effective. And that's at every level. Policymakers need to know here at the state level and at the local level. Educators need to know right in the classroom. Parents need to know. So a data system really ought to have strong student data that's monitored across the spectrum, as I described earlier, from early childhood, and in some states and countries, we go right up into work. So we can find out if you have taken certain types of courses, participated in certain college programs, what kinds of jobs are you likely to move into? And, we ought to be able to know if you drop out, what kinds of opportunities are available to you, what kinds of jobs are being taken by those students. You want value-added data, and you want vertically scaled information. You want to be able to find out about improvement within the year and across years. It's not enough to just have cut-point data. Whatever your targets may be as a policy, you really want to be able to know what occurred, how much growth occurred in any given point in time. We want to make sure that parents can be a part of the system of accountability for education. So you need to, again, make sure that they have information that is useful, intelligible, and timely. In optimal systems, you link this to health and social services and other information that educators can use. So you don't just operate in a vacuum with some test scores here in the classroom. You know what's going on with your students that lead to those outcomes that you do, in fact, have. Privacy is always a key issue, but I got to tell you, Florida, Ohio, and others have worked these issues out. There are ways to create these systems, very comprehensive information systems that have usable information and don't have any kind of privacy concerns or risks available to the participants in the system. You also want teacher data that is sufficient to evaluate the effectiveness of programs. It would be useful to know that all the graduates of College X, School of Education, are teaching classes where the students have very poor reading outcomes. It's going to tell us something about the reading instruction that is being given to those teacher candidates at that university. So it's really about program effectiveness overall. Let me move from there. So in school and district data, you want finance data as well as performance data available, again, just to be able to evaluate the entire system. We don't have those things in the comprehensive way that I just described. I can run through very quickly these 10 essential elements. A unique statewide student identifier, we have that. Enrollment, demographic, and program participation information about our students, we have that. Information on students that didn't get tested, we have that here in California. Student level graduation and dropout data, we now have that. This is our first year with it. And then data audit systems, we have that here in California. There are 5 more elements considered essential, critical to having a quality data system that California does not yet have. One is this teacher identifier system. We now, in recent years, we've had statute that has us building that system. We're moving forward. Important within the academic construct here. It's considered important to be able to match teachers and students to better understand the system. The legislature in the special session just passed a law that was signed by the governor that allows that. You need to have the ability to match individual students' test records across years and measure growth. That's something I described. The state, I've marked this in asterisk because the State Board of Education is actually having a very constructive dialogue about how they might best approach that. So about a year and a half ago, I think it is, we put out a new contract for state testing that does not include growth measurement. It does not include vertical scaling. And so there are questions about whether that contract should be revisited, and if so, at what cost, et cetera. But that is a constructive conversation happening at the State Board right now. We don't have student-level transcript information. We don't have student-level college readiness test scores. We don't have the ability to match student records across from preschool right into higher education. But those are essential. Recommendations from the 4 reports regarding data insofar as it's essential to supporting improved learning and accountability. Master Plan for Education, let's have this comprehensive data system. At the time of the Master Plan for Education, you had Senator Alpert, the chair of that committee, was working concurrent with the master plan to create the unique student identifier on which that system could be built. So at that time, it was very relevant to just say we need a data system. I always like to tell the personal story that the first bill that I worked on at the beginning of my career, my first year at Department of Education 20 years ago, was the first bill that created a comprehensive data system in California. And 20 years later, we're moving toward it. We'll get there. We're confident. The Master Plan for Education was occurring at a time of great political infighting regarding the control and monitoring of data and great distrust. And so the Master Plan actually recommended creating a new independent agency. Completely, don't house this with the Department of Ed, don't house it with the IT department here in the state that existed at that time. Don't house it with the Department of Finance. Something new that, nobody hates them yet. Let's have the data managed there so that we have trust that it's not processed data, that it's raw and honest data, and then also build state-level analytical capacity there. The master plan envisioned keeping that entity in, for all practical purposes, in perpetuity. The Governor's Committee on Education Excellence looked at what we have now and the progress we've been making and continue to make as recently as in the current special session and said, let's keep moving it forward, build it out, add the data elements that are needed to be effective, link those elements, gain information from gain data from other information systems such as social services, move to growth measures on assessments so that we can better inform the kind of value added that is occurring in our education system, overhaul the school accountability report cards so that they are intelligible to parents and others, and then increase database access, which I understand the current special session, there is a bill, SB 5X, I believe, by Subcommittee, that is working to, again, with very strong privacy protections, make sure that researchers and other educators are able to get at that data and better help us evaluate the system so that we can have improved education at the local level, improved educational policy at the state level. Getting down to facts, again, just saw this as a fundamental, saw a data system, as we're describing here, as a fundamental underpinning of any kind of systematic evaluation and any kind of continuous improvement in our education system. Little Hoover Commission looked at very distinctly building out CalPads and CalTides, simplifying SARC, making sure that the data gets back to those who need it at the ground level in a processed, analyzed way, and then improving parents' access to data. I want to try to limit being redundant here because those are your options for this committee to consider on a policy level, and we'll come in a moment to what would it take to actually implement them. One of the considerations that the Governor's Committee undertook was that you probably could use a short-term data commission to just get movement on developing a long-term strategic plan. This, of course, occurred before the McKinsey report and the kind of work that's going on right now, but frankly, as someone outside that system at this moment, it's very hard to tell what exactly is happening, what kind of progress is being made, though certainly things are happening. Well, things, we think, yes. Let me see. I think that this has all been covered. So, what can the committee do? As I said earlier in response to your question, there's really quite a bit that can be done by the committee without moving into the Constitution. Most of our educational entities, and you have to include the legislature and the governor and the courts, are created in the Constitution. Very few of the duties related to our education system are delineated in the Constitution. The State Board of Education reviews and approves 3 of the deputies at the Department of Ed, and reviews and approves K-8 textbooks. That would be it. Everything else is in the 100,000 section education code, and so virtually all of that is accessible to you. So how could you go about implementing any of these recommendations that you as a committee might decide to pursue? The first would be coming back to the whole state governance structure that you discussed at your first hearing, an enormous omnibus bill. And during the master plan process, you may recall, Senator, we actually had Leg Council draft a tentative draft on what it would take, and it's about 6 inches thick in single-spaced 10 font type. There are just thousands of education code sections that would need to be changed, and so you might think about doing it in a progressive way, starting with the most important of those functions. But your alignment would be, based on these recommendations from these reports, creating a Secretary of Education in statute, not just several positions carved out in the budget, and giving that entity primary authority over the operations of the public school system. What we think of right now is many of the programmatic functions of the Department of Education, with the exception of the data testing accountability functions. And at the same time, you want to shift the focus of the Department of Education to provide more support to districts and to not just have the Secretary of Education now manage the compliance-focused process. Then you have a new Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction with probably anywhere from 200 to 400 of those employees that are doing all the things that are currently done on testing, on assessment, on accountability, operating some of those functions, overseeing regional management of others of them. So, and by carving this out, you actually now have a superintendent of public instruction, as I said before, with no conflicts of interest, who can evaluate the state's performance. How is the legislature doing and the governor in allocating resources consistent with the state standards, consistent with the principles that we say that we have? Make the State Board of Education primarily advisory to the governor. And you could leave the K-8 textbooks there if you didn't want to get into the Constitution. Finally, in this state realignment, you can consider whether you wanted a short-term or long-term entity to manage data. The Governor's Committee envisioned that it would take some time. Again, this report's 2 years ago, and we were looking at Superintendent O'Connell having one more year in office. You wouldn't want this to happen. You would want to make sure that any candidates for the superintendency would know what they're running for. So it might be even something that you want to do at this stage 4 years out if you pursue it, or move very quickly and do it for this next term. The Governor's Committee felt that it would be good to have some sort of a data commission that was interim to the shifting of the accountability responsibilities solely to the Superintendent of Public Instruction. The Governor's Committee actually suggested that the legislature have the SPI lead a study to figure out what it would take to implement all of these changes at the state level. Again, so that you're not faced first and foremost with a 6-inch thick ledge council draft of what it's going to take. Just a few more pages here, a few more slides. Also at the state level, continued reform of budget practices. This committee could help guide its colleagues in the legislature in doing things that are consistent with the kind of structural reforms that you might want to do statutorily. Or you could do these independently. Again, much progress in this budget in consolidating categorical funding and getting rid of those. So when you consolidated the 40 programs, the language actually indicated that, for all practical purposes, all districts are now compliant with the requirements of those 40 programs if they receive and use those funds, whatever they use them for. That's extraordinary flexibility. That's extraordinary reduction in workload that, if the resources were there, would really free up a lot of educator time at the local level. In addition to that kind of consolidation, you can look at identifying the very highest priorities beyond what it takes to effectively educate the so-called average student. Where do you think additional resources are needed? The one thing that all of these reports cited clearly need, or the two things clearly need significant additional investments, are economically disadvantaged students and English learners. There are other priorities that you may have. There's a lot of debate on what some of the other things should be. But frankly, when you start that conversation, you're moving right back into the categorical conversation. The Governor's Committee, in its final retreat, actually dropped 7 of its recommendations because they realized, well, these are just our favorite categoricals. So it's good to keep that ethos in mind, that you really want to, if you're going to simplify this system to the benefit of a true standards and accountability-based system and that empowers local educators, you want to keep it as clean as you can, while supporting those things that need support. Finally, on budget practices, make sure that the targeted funding gets where the students are that generate it. Eliminate some of the skewed incentives and disincentives of our system where we fund failure and take away money when you make progress in any of a number of ways, whether it's you've moved students out of a support program or you have these interventions where there is failure and we invest in that, you begin to make progress and we take the money back. That is something that just has to change if we're going to try to foster innovation at the local level and success. And then just get out of the way. If we believe in accountability, if we believe in local control, you have the structures, you have the standards, let it work. Statute to implement the regional and oversight system that I've described that would be managed by the county, the 11 county regions. You do need budget to support this. You have to build the capacity in order to operate this kind of a system. The same thing, budget and statute to develop an ACMET equivalent of the FICMAT for the most consistent struggling districts. And create the school inspection and support system that I described. You could immediately do a pilot. There's been some great commitment to California from several major foundations. Several of these reports were supported by the Stewart, Hewlett, Gates, and Irvine foundations. We all know from observing what happened in Britain, what's happened in some states on the East Coast, you got to build this over time. I won't say slowly, but it takes time. There are no inspectors in California. There is no inspection framework in California. But your statute would need to, a statute to implement this kind of system would probably best serve the process if it identified the framework itself. What kinds of things could be included in that? You need to build that capacity and constantly evaluate the system so that we know that the inspections are consistent and reliable. And then you have to have the support. You don't, if this is going to be effective and collaborative and not another form of gotcha accountability, you need to make sure that something can be done to make the improvements that the inspection reports recommend. And then finally, I think that statute, budget, and frankly just political capital getting behind the kinds of changes that first Superintendent Easton made in shifting the compliance reviews, and now what Superintendent O'Connell is doing in terms of trying to emphasize program support to districts rather than this strong compliance. And so you have your brokers of excellence, for example, brokers of expertise that is trying to help cross-fertilize. One district is doing something remarkably well. Let's get that district, the information from what they're doing well, into the hands of other districts and even support that district or create some other sort of superstructure or infrastructure so that they can help other districts to implement, let alone know about, that really effective practice. Things of that nature are already begun, and they could use additional legislative support. Build out the data system. That is primarily a function of budget. But if you're going to have a temporary or long-term entity, that would take legislation. You'll want legislation. It is probably best to have legislation to clearly define for the long term the elements of a data system that you want. And that allows also for a very broad public conversation about what those elements should be, what the purposes of those elements being included are, and what kind of firewalls for safety, privacy, and avoidance of unintended consequences. What exactly are we doing here to make sure that everything is going to be safe? And then, as I indicated to you, there's legislation underway right now to do one of these recommendations, make data more accessible. Overhauling the school accountability report card requires legislation, a very small budget augmentation to help with the process, and then I don't know how you get discipline to keep it from becoming the Christmas tree that it's become, but I think that even if, knowing that one committee cannot control that for the future, just you could make extraordinary progress by rolling back a great deal of what's already been added on to the accountability report card at its many different layers. If you try to pursue these, some impediments that I personally would like to advise the committee that they may run into. First of all, I was told when I was first hired for the master plan that there is no constituency for change. I feel it in my bones and every fiber of my being. The three of you on this committee are a very strong voice, have the potential to be a very strong voice in the entire policymaking arena. You have to know that sometimes you will stand alone, simply because many are just trying to survive and be effective today with current budget situations, all the challenges students are bringing to the classroom, and up to the state level as well. So you can't assume that you will have any or many allies in this. There are significant costs to capacity building. I know that this is a subcommittee focused on governance, but everything that I've described requires some capacity building. There are no inspectors. You don't have the data system. You can't assume that 7,000, 8,000 principals will know how to use data effectively once you start getting it to them. There are many different capacity building costs, and there's actually a strong task of building capacity. If you want more and better prepared teachers, you have to start with the preparers. They aren't out there. If you gave the CSU $20 million more right now, there are not education professors out there available for them to hire. The same with districts that do district internships. So there's a capacity building process that's critical here, and I would caution you to never forget that as you pursue any of these changes. It's important to know that anytime you're dealing with a governance change, someone elected is having things changed on them. If you give more authority to a county, you're taking it away from a district or the state, and there may be bristling based solely on that, even if those who are ostensibly losing that authority could recognize that it can lead to a more effective system. Finally, so many of us here in Sacramento talk about the Byzantine bureaucratic system that we have, but it didn't happen by accident. So many things were negotiated over the decades individually, and for many of them there were very serious trade-offs. So we can sit here today and look at, I certainly in my roles have heard many criticisms of specific elements of collective bargaining that are said to hamstring certain processes now. Concessions were made to get the advantage, if you will, that exists there. So the representatives of those organizations that have those interests are not sitting here looking at good government and good effective processes today. They're looking at that whole history, and we have to recognize that. That doesn't mean don't take it on. It means any of these processes. It means recognize that there is much at stake, and there's much history. And consistent with that, one of the things that certainly those involved with the master plan and those involved with the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence saw is that there are many who will form a coalition, if you will, who are happy to support their colleagues in averting a change because they could be next. Doesn't matter to me independently one whit, but I could be the one that you take on next. And so you get very interesting coalitions coming in with resistance. There's genuine fear of unintended consequences. I will again actually at this moment mention the unions. There's been a lot of criticism of teachers' unions about their pursuit of their effort to maintain a so-called firewall between teacher and student data systems. They have said, make sure that the state doesn't go in and try to judge teachers based on data you have up here, not knowing anything about schools, about student conditions, school conditions, which teacher is teaching whatever. And many people are critical of that approach. But back in, was it 98, we had the Governor's Performance Awards, Governor's Performance Awards under Gray Davis. It was 1999, $10,000 per teacher, not knowing a thing about what was happening in that particular school. Was this a gate teacher? Was a teacher who didn't get an award? Did they have all migrant students in their classroom? So there are very valid reasons for a lot of these objections and concerns that you hear raised. That doesn't mean don't pursue them. It means think about how you mitigate the unintended consequences. Mistaken information, disinformation. Again, you and your colleagues on this subcommittee all sat on the Master Plan for Education. I believe that eliminating students might be the only thing we weren't accused of eliminating at some point in the process. But we heard, and I know that some of it was genuine, that people thought, we were talking about some consolidation of county offices, that there is a proposal to eliminate every county office of education. It wasn't there. Every member of the Senate Education Committee, when the first governance bill came before it, heard from every elected board member in their Senate district who was a board member of a small school district, who had heard we were going to eliminate small school districts, pure and simple. you will get that kind of, there's the potential for that kind of response based on either misinformation, disinformation, or genuine fear and concern. You run into enormous legal constraints. You know far better than I the kinds of court cases, constitutional amendments, and other very strong statutes and regulations that make it very difficult to accomplish the sorts of things that you want to accomplish. The last thing that I want to comment on is you never know where anybody's going to be coming from. The Governor's Committee was criticized in many quarters for having, of its 18 members, ultimately 5 administrators. One was actually promoted from a teacher to a principal right around the time she was put on the committee. Administrators were interviewed in the Getting Down to Facts study, hundreds of them, and many of the things that they wanted drive some of the recommendations for different reasons, but drive some of the recommendations of the Governor's Committee on Education Excellence. There's $10.5 billion recommended for schools generally, much of which is for students with particular needs. There are $4 billion of which is for improving the teacher capacity, and with that, giving what administrators in this survey, this Getting Down to Facts survey, said was their highest priority, greater ability to control the hiring and firing of teachers. Several other things. Many people see the wish list of administrators as being a strong subset of the Governor's Committee recommendations. And when our report came out, we were given a C+ by AXA because they felt very strongly about they felt very strongly that the state-level governance recommendations of the Governor's Committee were wrong-headed. And so who knows where anybody's going to come from. It is a daunting task, and I will continue to be available to help you in any way with advice or counsel, and I bid you Godspeed.
Thank you very much, Devin. It is a daunting task. Thank you very much, Stefan. It is a daunting task, but, I started on this kind of road because I'm most concerned about kids and the kind of education that they are receiving. And what you've described is a whole hierarchy of how the adults have become the main focus here, and it disturbs me that we're consumed with that conversation. Okay, but thank you. I don't think I have any questions. I've lots of stuff to mull over and think about. Probably we'll see you again in the near future. But I'd like to ask Lisa Giroux from the Senate Office of Research to summarize the subcommittee comments that we had in July 29th in San Diego. And yours is much shorter.
Yes. You got your mic?
Yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Senator Liu. Since Stefan so aptly summarized the key recommendations contained in the four most recent governance committees, governance studies, I'm going to focus my presentation strictly on comments presented during the public portion of the July 29th hearing. And at that hearing, the public portion included testimony from individuals associated with school site councils, district advisory committees, school boards, and parent organizations from Los Angeles, San Diego, and Pasadena. And there seemed to be a broad consensus among the speakers that school district governance needed to engage in more and stronger parent partnerships and more shared decision-making. It was recognized by several of the presenters that resources are best utilized when kept at the school site level. And while there was recognition and appreciation for resource flexibility, for example, with regard to categorical programs, there was concern expressed by several individuals of the importance of holding school boards, superintendents, and administrators accountable for the proper use of these resources. One question that was raised several times was, how do we ensure that school districts and county offices of education are held accountable? And for those testifying, accountability was defined in terms of maintaining and enforcing rigorous standards for all schools and subgroups, as well as engaging parents and their communities in school-based decision-making. Several speakers commented that the state does not levy sufficient consequences when school districts go awry. And at the same time, and at the state level, regarding accountability and transparency, it was felt that whatever restructuring were to take place must ensure that both the State Board of Education as well as the Superintendent of Public Instruction were to be held accountable. And both the 2002 Master Plan for Education and the 2008 Governor's Committee on Education Excellence recommended that the State Superintendent of Public Instruction assume Inspector General functions and accountability over school districts. And even under this scenario, with the superintendent serving as Inspector General, it was feared that local district compliance could be overlooked. Subgroups within schools and districts could continue to be ignored with no consequences levied. And similarly, these same reports recommended making the State Board of Education an advisory body to the governor. And again, it was feared that this could result in too much discretion given to districts and would eliminate the board's authority to hold locals accountable. Local district folks count on the board's ability to sanction and withhold waivers from districts and to keep them compliant and in line. An advisory board simply would not have this authority nor ability. So there's this tension between two truths, that resources and decision-making are best kept at the local level, since they know their needs and responsibilities better than the state does. However, locals frequently misuse these resources with too much discretion granted to unions, boards, and superintendents and administrators, who may be prone to ignore student needs and what school site councils consider important. And this is when locals look to the state to step in and intercede. So as the committee moves forward, I think it's important to recognize these two absolutes and to create a governance structure that creates a balance between the appropriate role of local districts and the state. A structure that allows locals the flexibility to use their resources in a manner that best suits the needs of their students, but provides a means for holding them accountable when they do not.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, let's do the panels of stakeholders. We have Gary Ravani, President, Early Childhood K-12 Council of the California Federation of Teachers. Welcome, Gary. Is Laura Preston here? Yeah. Okay. She's legislative advocate for ACSA, the Association of California School Administrators. And Al Sandrini, Executive Director of Small School Districts Association. Welcome, and I think we have had questions posed to you to address. Yes. Okay, we'll start with Gary.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for inviting us here today. I'm Gary Ravani, and I am President of the Early Childhood K-12 Council of the California Federation of Teachers. I come both as a representative of the teachers organization and as a teacher with 35 years of experience in the classroom, 31 of those years at the middle school level. I'm somewhat relieved that we have combined the presentation here today, because when I looked at the questions and I looked at the various studies, I was having some difficulty in creating the necessary dichotomy that the discussion seemed to be driven by. I saw various levels of governance, yes, but like a very complicated Venn diagram, we have overlapping circles of governance from the state level down through the regional level, down to the local level, down to the school, and down to the classroom. So it's important to look at governance not only within those various circles, but also where they overlap. So I hope I hit those points as I move through my presentation. The topic today is exploring ways to make school governance in the state more efficient, more effective, with greater transparency and accountability. Those are admirable goals and difficult to argue with. However, as is usually the case, the devil's in the details. I'd like to point out some of these details contained in the major recommendations of the recent governance and accountability reports. The Master Plan for K-12 Education recommends, for efficiency's sake, I presume, to move the State Department of Education and all significant K-12 decision-making powers into the office of the governor, leaving the elected superintendent of instruction with some accountability functions, but primarily in the role of advisor and spokesperson, a figurehead, basically. As an efficiency move, there may be some points here that could be argued, but in terms of small d democratic move, and for issues of public accountability and institutional independence, there are no merits to this proposal. There are obvious questions of checks and balances here between the executive and legislative branches. Perhaps even more important to the classroom educator of long standing, the concept of totally centralizing authority for education. There is the probability that schools would be in the governor's office. There is a probability that schools would be even more subject to political and ideological whipsawing than they are now. Consolidating power in the governor's office or the appointment of a secretary of education with control of the Department of Education, appointing the State Board of Education, is the antithesis of a system that would be subject to meaningful input from stakeholders. Efficiency is positive, but it must be balanced against the inherent, sometimes clumsy processes that are fundamental to the democratic system. Our schools are the bedrock of that system. The flip side of that issue is the Secretary of Education's office. Education-related decisions from the governor's office seem most frequently made by the governor's regular staff in a finance office. The Secretary's office may well represent a redundancy that needs to be examined. For the State Board of Education, some of the reports proposed redefining the role of the board, making it solely an advisory body. Certainly when you take a fairly recent example of the actions of the board and unilateral decision regarding 8th grade algebra, a decision almost universally condemned by those who are actually educational practitioners, as well as the state superintendent, that suggests those redefinition proposals merit serious consideration. Perhaps the most critical proposals made in the various governance reports are those recommending strengthening control and giving more flexibility to local educational agencies. This should be done. It must be done in a balanced fashion that takes into account that there are vulnerable categories of children and programs that require protection. This flexibility should occur not only for physical resources, but also for fundamental decisions that need to be made for the most efficient educational outcomes. Powerful classroom instruction. These decisions are around assessments, curriculum, and textbook selection. Since 2002, the year the master plan was redrafted and the year No Child Left Behind began implementation, we have learned some things. Absolute faith in market forces to do well by the economy was misplaced. Also, that absolute faith in top-down command and control, highly prescriptive education reform was misplaced. Current governance structures based on these flawed top-down assumptions have damaged the ability of teachers to do their work. Any governance structures in the future that would follow that trend only mimic efficiency and transparency will just exacerbate that damage. Educational governance structures, when seen in the macro level, should facilitate efficient, transparent communication, embed common levels of accountability between all stakeholders at all levels. And finally, governance structures should optimally concentrate on decentralization and putting the locus of control for best instructional practice as close to districts, schools, and classrooms as possible. Efficient governance structures will comprehensively systematize and promote educational policy decision-making that flows not just from the state to classrooms, but also from classrooms to the state. Thank you.
Excuse me as I get adjusted here. Laura Preston, I'm with the Association of California School Administrators, and the comments that I'm going to share with you are those that after each and every one of these government reform efforts, ACSA put together a task force of our members from throughout the state, all different kinds of administrators, to review the proposals that were outlined. And with each of those, we produced a report of our positions, and so I'm going to just sort of highlight some of those. So the comments that I'm making are those that I've heard from our members over the multiple years and multiple reform efforts. but one of the things that we've always heard, and I hear this still continuously from our membership, is really a lack of understanding at the local level of the governance structure in Sacramento for education. Who's in charge and responsible for what? What does the Secretary of Education do, and what is his or her role? What is the role of the SPI versus the role of the State Board? And what is the role of the legislature in terms of the role of the SPI and the State Board? And the Department of Education serves whom? We understand that there is no one model that is perfect, and whatever structure is established acts or urges that the roles of all parties involved should be clearly, delineated, thank you, and that some K-12 education leadership experience should be required for those who will direct education policy. And the role of the Secretary of Education, I'm going to just take the three different major issues and where we are in those three. As you know, the Secretary is a relatively new position created under Governor Wilson. It really has no statutory authority. There's nothing out there that says what they should do or what it should be comprised of and what their role is. So it's suggested every time we have a new governor in place, and the roles have been expanded. They have done some good work, but frankly, we AXA recommends the abolition of the Secretary of Education. We think that there needs to be some sort of liaison from the governor's office to the education community, and what that looks like. It could be a consultant, it could be a cabinet level position, and some governors have been known to include the SPI, the state SPI, at some of that level too, and utilizing the SPI in that kind of structure. But the cost of running the Secretary of Education's office and the benefits just are not equated. We think that it's an area that just adds confusion to the school districts and the communities at large. We also support the current position of an elected SPI, a constitutional officer who voters can hold responsible for the quality of public education. I think over the years, the authority of what the SPI has had as far as their role has been diminished, and they don't have the current SPI and the former SPI certainly have not had the authority aligned with the responsibility and accountability associated with a statewide constitutional officer that is responsible to the electorate. We would rather see that position strengthened and made more accountable. We also, with regards to the State Board, we have seen firsthand the State Board taking over more of a policy role than they have in the past. Not only are they interpreting the laws that the legislature have passed, but they're actually making policy. And I don't think that was something that was ever intended. It could have been, I don't know, but I don't think so. And so I know there's been some concern between the legislative branch and the State Board as to who's in charge of some of the policy that's moving forward certain agendas. We think that the members of the State Board, one, should be a position that is linked to just policy matters, and that the implementation should be left to the SPI, that the members of the State Board ought to be composed of those with at least some K-12 educational experience, since they're making decisions that affect those in the field, and if they don't have that experience, they don't know the decisions that they're making and what their impact could be to the school districts and to the individual teachers and administrators. And we also think that the State Board, if it is to continue, should be representative geographically of the state, so that there's representation from all sectors of the state, so that every type of community can be represented. I also want to touch base on a couple of your other questions that you have, and that really I think there's more of a pro than any con to doing any kind of state reform. I can't imagine it getting much worse than what it is, so I think anything you do is something positive. Again, we would love it to be what we see as a vision of the world, but we want to be involved with you to help you in trying to ascertain what those changes should be, because clearly our members don't know. If they don't know the process and who's in charge of what, a regular rank and file, parent or a person on the street is certainly not going to understand. And I also want to talk about, too, a little bit of what we've seen, and this has been something that has just been the movement from the last 20, 30 years, but since Prop 13 passed, and I don't want to go after the funding of Prop 13, but the fact that when Prop 13 passed, since the state became in charge of education and other issues, then whoever's in charge of the purse strings is in charge of the policy. And I don't think it's any question that there's a correlation between when California's public schools were the best in the nation to where they have now been not the best in the nation. From others, groups have mentioned that. And I think there's a direct relationship to that timing, because you have the legislature, you have the state board, you have others making policy decisions based on the fact that everybody's gone to school, so everybody is an authority on education. And so making decisions and policy changes, and we've seen K-12 have to move from one extreme to the other. I mean, one example is under a prior governor when we got rid of career technical education because everyone was going to go to college. And now that pendulum's swinging back to, well, gee, maybe not everybody is going to go to college, or maybe there's not room for everybody in college, and so let's bring career tech back, and we see academic achievement from those students. So public education has been at the whim of this process for so long, and actually, I think they've done a really fine job with the areas that are out there. We've got people at the 30,000-foot level making decisions for people that are on the 1-foot level, that they are the ones on the ground. And frankly, I think our members have repeatedly stated to us is, why can't the legislature, the state board, whomever, make the decisions of what they want the outcomes to be, and then leave us alone to implement them. And so that would be probably my last message to all of you. To the extent that we can get to that level would be welcomed by everybody.
Thank you. Actually, our comments are very reflective of the comments you've just heard. By way of background, I was a superintendent, retired superintendent, 16 years, a small district outside of Bakersfield. And we share, as an organization, the small school district, many of the comments that Laura has shared with you, and it would be redundant for me to go over specifically everything. But there are a couple points I would like to make. And with your permission, I would just file this written report with Suzanne tomorrow for your review at a later date. The view of 100 categorical programs and trying to maintain the distinctiveness of each of those is difficult. We are strong advocates for local control. Now, whether you have a state department, a board of a state board, a public school instructor, or a public school superintendent, or an appointee of the governor, I don't know that we're smart enough to figure out which one of those is the best. But I can tell you this. We are thoroughly convinced that the more decisions that are made at the local level, the better that decision is. Now, that might be the 30,000-foot versus the 1-foot comment made earlier. We're strong advocates of that. We also believe that you should set the standards, which you have done and are doing. You should tell us what needs to be accomplished, and then we're strong advocates to get out of our way and let us do it. Don't tell us how to do it. We are strong believers in that. Your responsibility, as you know, is to fund it properly. We can't meet these obligations with inadequate funding. So much of our time now is spent on dealing in categorical programs which address fringe issues and fringe populations of our diverse state. And yet we're forced to deal with all students, which we should be doing. But we have to spend more time addressing that middle ground. The school and the program we had back in the 60s and the 70s prior to Prop 13, which were mentioned earlier, we had a great reputation. Our reputation isn't that great right now, and we can't put that all at the foot of Prop 13. But what we can say is that the more demands that are made on the local entities to provide an educational service from the state without proper funding is moving us towards a state of failure, not a state of success. And so with that, I would conclude my comments and suggest to you that if you had any questions to which I could respond, I would be glad to do so, as I'm sure other members of the panel would.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. So, what I got from their comments was that you don't like, none of you like what the various studies have proposed in terms of a clarification for governance. Correct?
I don't know that I would go quite that far. I mean, I think there's some things that we like and there's some things that we didn't like.
You don't like the Secretary of Education?
We don't like the Secretary of Education.
You don't like the Secretary of Education?
Don't like the Secretary of Education.
Okay. The SPI, you accept it for being an elected person as opposed to being an appointed person by the governor?
That would be our preference.
Correct.
Correct.
You want more authority for the SPI, perhaps, in terms of policy. The SPI is in charge of the Department of Education.
Right. If you're going to have an elected SPI, then there needs to be a stronger role for that person.
So, who makes policy and who does the accountability?
Do you want
Well, the accountability would be within his or her office, the state
The SPI.
SPI office. And we're for that transparency and we're for that accountability. That has to be a part of the program. But having it coming from an elected official's office as opposed to a political appointee's appointment office, which will change every year depending on the election, which it will change in the PSI, but it's less of a political appointee when it's elected by the public as opposed to being appointed by a governor.
It's interesting. Okay, and what about the Board of Education, the State Board of Education?
I subscribe to Laura's comments that there have been times when we think they have overstepped their bounds in terms of creating policies beyond their authority.
So it's the legislature that's supposed to create policy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Our education committees, et cetera, not the
Yes.
State Board of Education.
Right.
We agree
Gary?
with
Going back to a question you asked a minute ago, I'm not sure if it's an issue of the authority of the elected superintendent.
Okay.
I think it's more an issue of the process that's put in place. And again, the connection between those county offices of education that were described as being highly valued in all of their communities, how they relate to local school districts, and the relationship between the school districts and the county offices and the state. Indeed, the policy should be made by the legislature, and then it's the duty of the superintendent to carry out those policies in concert with those other stakeholders.
Okay. What about the locally controlled school boards? What are they doing? What
I
are
think
they
that they're
run?
holding accountable the superintendent and their district personnel to make sure that they're following through with the goals of what they've established and the goals of what the legislature has established. You know, there's nobody. I don't know of any position that is more visible than a school superintendent or a local principal, and so all eyes are on them already. You've got with NCLB or ESEA and now Race to the Top, more accountability, more transparency on these positions. And so I think there's on the natural already there's a lot of observation going on and making sure that they're doing what they're doing. But I think the role of the board is to make sure that their employees are following through with their policy. Because I think what that happens is the state's got to set a policy, but the best education reform is if a school board is allowed to interpret or to develop what they need to do for their local communities, and then have the superintendent and their staff carry it out. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we would be strong supporters of any decision that can be made at the local level should be made at the local level. The consolidation of these consolidated programs, which was done at a state level to address fiscal issues, is a course we would encourage you to pursue when fiscal issues are not the driving force behind it. As it relates to what are school boards doing, especially in small districts, it's sometimes hard to define what their role really is because they lose sight of what that is because they are so close to the instructional program. I've worked with small school districts throughout the state, and I've always told them that I've always felt that they have a much more difficult job than a trustee in San Jose or Los Angeles or one of our larger urban areas, because when they make a decision, it affects their neighbors who they know, it affects relatives of theirs who live in the community who they know, who they run into at the grocery store, and so they are closer to what are the driving forces within that community and within that district. Granted, school boards and superintendents often make mistakes, and when those mistakes are made, it's pointed out to them through the local public involvement. I think the parents are much more involved now than they were 20 years ago. I think they're much more involved now 10 years ago. They're wiser. They are they're taking their role more responsibly. Towards the tail end of my career, I always felt that parents were trying to gain that participation. I think now they're more than welcome to be a partner in that education. Those of us in schools, whether we're being a teacher in the class, when we have the parental support, and that's just not a rubber stamp, yes, do it, you're doing a fine job. It's really checking homework. It's visiting the classroom.
Correct.
It's being a partner. That child has a much better chance of succeeding. And I think that's something we would all agree at. And that happens at the local level. That can't be legislated. That has to be motivated through the participation of the school board, the school teacher, and the school administrators.
Okay, you'd all agree, Gary?
I would agree with that, too, that the school board's in an extremely sensitive position. They are the interface between district administration and the public. And again, with the involvement of the public, it's the job, obviously, of the school administration to implement the policies as handed down from both the legislature and the superintendent of schools. And creating an understandable, a democratic forum where parents can come to ask the critical questions and try to gain some understanding of just what the policies are in a particular district and how they're being carried out is a vital function.
So before Prop 13, local control was where the action was, and school districts could raise their own funds to support their own programs. Now the state collects the money and redistributes it in some kind of equal fashion, many different formulas. And it's very confusing to parents in these communities. I always get asked the question, why does Beverly Hills get X number of dollars for their students and Pasadena gets X number of dollars and there's a discrepancy and Beverly Hills gets more? So, it's from the state level, it's how do we smooth out these questions? How do we say who's in charge actually of policy? Who are all these people that we have created? Who's responsible for policy? How do we simplify it so people can understand what they're exactly getting for their tax dollars? I mean, this is the point of having this governance committee trying to ferret through, and you've seen the many different studies that have come through this process over the years. It's how do we change it to be more responsive to folks?
That's a difficult question. What you've just outlined is a whole lot of reform, and I think that you need to figure out where you want to start, and start there, and then some of the. Because funding of education for Prop 98 reform is something that AXA would welcome wholeheartedly. It's going to take a lot of work to do that, and I know there's some groups out there that have talked about trying to do that. But to start at maybe the state governance level and figure that out, and then we can start moving.
That's what this committee is the accountability, governance issues, and yet from the studies that have been mentioned that Mr. Blake went through in great detail, there is a consensus among the studies to kind of move toward the Secretary of Education and make the SPI the person with the hammer, the accountability person, and to make the school board an advisory role to the governor, et cetera. And yet, having this conversation with you, you don't like that model.
We don't like the model that the governor's the only one that's really got all the accountability. Everything there are those who subscribe to the governor is held accountable to the voters, and that he or she should be in charge of public education, and that everything should run through that office. I think I'm nervous about that because of what I've seen over the years. I think continuity is the most important thing that you can provide to school districts throughout the state, and some sustainability. And depending on who the governor is, they've got every single thing out there that's a priority for them, and depending on if there's a disaster or whatever happens. So they have to, that would mean that they have to be an expert in public education. They're going to have to be an expert in insurance and healthcare and everything else. We think public education is so important that it is entitled to have its own person out there that, and obviously the voters have thought so for years and years and years, to have that person be the leader of the public education, K-12 public education. And that's where we subscribe, not because we don't want to see reform. I think we would love to see reform and see some of the boxes shaken up. And clearly the Secretary of Education, that was a new thing. I mean, it doesn't have any proven really track record.
Right. It's not in statute.
It's not in statute, and it's just an entity. And, I have my own personal theories behind that. But, the reality is that it hasn't really been proven that that's the right mechanism either. So I think either you subscribe to the theory that everything goes through the governor is held accountable by the voters, that person could get tossed out in 4 years. I don't think I think that there's too much that the governor is involved in for that accountability if they, foul up in public education, for it to be held to the fire and have them tossed out in 4 years. I just don't see that. Whereas I think it's easier if you have a more streamlined process. So that's the question I think what really is before you is, do you believe that the governor's where it all ends all be all whatever, or not? And AXA doesn't think that's the right place.
The teachers don't, and the small school districts don't.
And Senator, I'd like to, one of the questions you asked that you originally talked about, the complex school finance and what needs to be done to fix it. And because it's such a complex issue, there is no simple answer, as you know. And when you talk about parents asking you questions on why is Pasadena funded at this level and Beverly Hills at that level, I can assure you that because it's so complex, trustees have difficulty comprehending it, and quite honestly, it will often take them 2 terms before they really grasp the funding mechanisms behind the mechanisms that fund our public schools. While superintendent, I was in one of those low-wealth districts. My neighboring district to the south received $4,000 a child more than I received. Now, I had to try and explain that to my constituents, my parents, when I didn't have as many teacher aides. I didn't have the same class size reduction before class size reduction, standardized that. And that's a difficult issue. But somehow, I think the state has to go back to the beginning, whenever that beginning was, which was back in the 60s, I think, is when we really began to make some changes, and then Prop 13 changed it again. And look at the conditions that existed and what were the driving forces to creating the formulas for funding public education. And if you can recraft it and redraft it and keep it simpler than it is today, you will have made a tremendous contribution. Reducing the number of categoricals, I've talked about that. If you could get that to 4 areas of need that the state has identified as priority, and do the block grants. We have to move more into that area to allow school districts flexibility to spread that money around. Now, we will often get into a difficult time, an emotional time with some of our teachers and some of the unions representing the teachers on how to spend that money. I was taken aback when I first heard the discussion of flexibility, because I've been an advocate of that for years. And yet 2 of my neighboring districts, who I respect a great deal, their superintendents came out in a newspaper and talked about, well, this may not be such a good idea. This is like months ago. And when I talked to them about that, they were setting the tone, because the union leadership said, aha, we got flexibility, we can spend that, we can go after that money. That's a tough thing for school administrators to have to be able to combat. But that's an issue, that's one of the real issues we have as well.
Right. Okay.
I think there's, excuse me.
Go ahead.
There was the golden age prior to the years of Prop 13, certainly in terms of a number of school districts being able to generate sufficient funds. It was a very different picture. However, I think most teachers, most educators agree with the values expressed through the Serrano-Priest decision, and that was we had many kids in this state who were not being given access to a high-quality education. That needed to be fixed. The revenue limit income that was put in place to fix it didn't, as we know. We can see wide discrepancies between high wealth districts and low wealth districts. And then, of course, there are the basic aid districts that are in a whole different category themselves. But There are issues that the legislature needs to deal with. I think some of them were mentioned in the presentation that we saw, that there needs to be a way to stabilize the funding stream that schools in California receive. But on top of that, there's the issue of adequacy of funding that schools in California receive, because I can't think of a study that's done throughout the United States that doesn't put California in the bottom 10 states
Correct.
in terms of funding per student.
Sure.
And that is such a huge and overwhelming issue that it's really difficult to talk about a lot of other issues without addressing that, right up front.
Sure. She wants to ask a question.
It's easier for me to ask it than to ask her to ask it. For the record, I'm Suzanne Reed. I'm Chief of Staff to Senator Carol Liu and the staff for the Select Committee. Regarding some of the local government recommendations, county offices of education, what is basically your attitude towards some of the regionalization recommendations that are contained in the various studies, and especially for the smaller school districts, some of which are kind of teetering on the edge now? Is there some consolidation that you see coming down the pike, and do you see a need for any state level policy or facilitation in those areas?
Well, there's no doubt that county superintendents are a primary service agency to the smalls.
Right.
If we have a school of roughly 500 students, we have a superintendent principal. We don't have usually a superintendent and a principal and a vice principal or whatever that. We have one person in there, and they rely heavily on the county office to provide services to them. If those services are removed to a regional level, now, I don't know what form this is going to take, but if we have 57 county offices and 10 regional offices, I don't think that's your intent. If that is your intent, I don't know why we would be opposed to that. However, if you're looking at changing 57 county offices to 10 regional offices representing multiple counties, then you are removing a level of service to the smalls, and we would have questions, very difficult and close questions, as to whether or not the small districts are going to be served better in that framework as opposed to their local county taking that
Right.
service.
That's
That would be
fair.
our point.
That's fair.
I would concur with what was just said. Yeah.
I would also, that the esteem that was suggested in the last report that the county offices have is deserved.
Okay. All right. Well, I think, any other questions? Do we have a public comment? I think we had a couple people who wanted to. Thank you very much. Oh, go ahead,
It
Gary.
was mentioned, you wanted me to briefly address the issue of pre-K.
Yes,
And
yes, I'm
I
sorry.
did want to do that. Absolutely important, and I think when we're looking at governance structures, if we started looking at the pre-K system and putting that, obviously, pre-K through 12, that would be advantageous. There's a study I saw not too long ago that said kindergarten is too late. Mm-hmm. In fact, our state testing vendor, the Educational Testing Service, did two studies at least. One called The Family, the nation's smallest schools. The other, Parsing the Achievement Gap, which gets to another issue. And ETS, taking a look at the tests that they administer, that 60% of the difference in achievement, the achievement gap then between high-achieving kids and kids who struggle, relate to family and community issues rather than school issues. Now, how do schools struggle with that? We've still got to deal with the issue, even if it is. And pre-K, I think, allows us to deal with those. Parsing the studies, you can see that the achievement gap as terminology itself is quite misleading. We're looking at quality and affordable housing gaps. We're looking at healthcare gaps. We're looking at stable and safe community gaps. We're looking at a wide variety. We're looking, obviously, at language gaps. All of these gaps cumulatively make up the achievement gap. Schools in pre-K would be the place to deal with that. What we know from the studies is kids are coming to kindergarten with the achievement gap in place.
Correct.
And the schools can't make up for those gaps. We've got to deal with it as much as we can. prior to that.
Earlier,
and
right.
pre-K programs, high-quality pre-K programs with well-paid teachers is the place to begin that process and really begin to tackle what is described as the achievement gap.
I appreciate the comments. I am an advocate for early childhood learning, and I had the opportunity to visit New Jersey in their program, and I was impressed with what they were doing with some of their lowest economic communities in New Jersey, and I think that's where we start. Instead of offering universal preschool, I'd like to offer it to those most in need, and see where we can move from there, and look at the data as we follow young people through the system. I'd like to do the data system from pre-K to when they leave college, pre-K to 20, to find out what we're doing. But we're having our own problems, just kind of getting started off the ground here with what we have. So those things, I mean, I like to use this time as kind of the planning, the conversation stage when we don't have, quote, a lot of resources, because it puts priorities in place about where we need to go when the economy recovers and all of us forget what it was when we were all lean. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate today your coming and sharing your concerns and your answering our questions and on educational governance and accountability, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Sir, one final comment, if I could. I don't want my comments to regarding the consolidating of the regions in the county office to sound like we're against any form of consolidation. In fact, we encourage our members, and we would encourage the state to look at providing incentives for smaller districts to consolidate services.
Yes.
They're even at the administrative level can small school districts share the services of one superintendent so they don't have to pay that themselves. Food service is another strong area. Transportation is another. Business services, IT support services. Are there places where smalls can provide, they can consolidate their services to provide that service? And we encourage our membership to do that, and we would encourage the state to examine ways and possibilities to providing incentives for smalls to do that type of activity.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, now we have time for public comment, and first is Dennis. Is it Sima? Chima. Hard C.
Hard C, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Dennis Chima, Senior Vice President of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. We're a public policy trade association in Silicon Valley composed of more than 300 employers. Actually, our founder was David Packard 31 years ago, who was a local school board member in Palo Alto. And I'll focus my remarks primarily on the K-12 governance level in Sacramento. And I also joined you on that New Jersey trip, and so I'm glad pre-K came up. And I'll also point out, ironically, that New Jersey's governor appoints the state board and the chief school officer, and it has yet to fall into the Atlantic Ocean. So that's the good news. And I'm also glad that you mentioned that this is a time for dialogue. The Silicon Valley Leadership Group and our members really think this is the time to dust off this issue and bring it back into light. And I'll just tell a story that I was having a one-on-one meeting with one of our CEOs. And that CEO runs a company that designs software, which designs chips in Silicon Valley. And needless to say, they have a lot of engineers employed there. And he asked me to prep him for a panel he was sitting on about education. And his first question to me was, I'm an engineer, I'd like to draw this out. Why don't you tell me who's in charge? An hour later, we were done with our meeting. And his response to me was, the state's governance code, or the governance structure is spaghetti code, is what they call it in software, that eventually you write extra code to fix what you fixed the last time, and eventually you have to throw the thing out. And so I'm glad that sparked me, it sparked our team to really dust off this issue. And timing is everything, because as I was briefing our members over the last few weeks and talking to education stakeholders about this issue, the thing that I heard was, yes, it's still a good idea, yes, it's still viable, but no, there's no champion. And I think Mr. Blake mentioned that there's really no champion for change here. And so the members of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group look forward to working with you and the subcommittee and the Education Committee on advancing this issue. We think the time is right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Good. We'll put you on our list.
Thank you.
Sharon Scott Dowd. Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm representing the Advancement Project, which is a civil rights organization here in California. We have an office here in Sacramento and one in Los Angeles, and we're really concerned about how, if you look at all of this governance, if you think in terms of looking at the teacher and the student and the parent, and put those glasses on and think about what the governance structure is that will help that situation. And sometimes when you look at all of this building and bureaucracy and who's in charge and so forth, it really is the teacher in charge and the parent in charge and the child responsible for learning. So we don't have any specific plan. We're respectful of all the different views. But when you talk about doing away with, when some people talk about doing away with categorical funds, the legislature put those in place originally because some children were being neglected. I mean, some people say, well, that's my pet project or whatever, but all of those came about
Correct.
Because districts weren't spending the money properly on children, especially poor children, children of color, children who are English learners. And so I think that when you look at building a professional practice for teachers, where they're respected, where they're well paid, where the community recognizes that they're doing a good job, and you respect the children for the extra things that they need. If you build a governance structure that will supply the money to do that and oversee it is important. Most of the things that Mr. Blake brought up were structural things, but nothing about where we're going to get the money to help that teacher and help that child and help that school bring about a good principal and a good relationship at that school, because that's really what this is about. And the Advancement Project would love to work with you and your staff as you move forward. But one of the biggest things is how we're going to pay for this. We've lost control of the funding that we need for this endeavor. We have the nation's highest standards, as you know, and we don't have the funding to deliver them. So it really wouldn't matter what governance structure you have if we don't give the governance structure some kind of responsibility for equitable school funding. So that's kind of where we're coming from.
Appreciate the comments.
Okay.
Anyone else?
We didn't exactly hit the top of the Nielsen ratings on the online, but we do have one comment that was submitted via email from Zella Knight, who is a parent at LA Unified School District, and her comment is, for an effective governance system to work, there must be a high level of accountability, transparency in decision-making, and the inclusion of constituents in the decision-making. What strategies are being proposed to increase parent involvement in the proposed structure and define specifically the role that compliance will play to the concept of reform? So I just wanted to add that to anyone listening, if you are listening out there, and to all of those who attended today, you can continue to submit your comments by email, and we'll be picking them up as the committee moves forward.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank you all for being here, and to those of you who participate online. And I look forward to our continued work together. And it's time to move these study recommendations to action so California and its residents have a public education system we need to lead productive lives and compete in the 21st century. So, Mike, I saw you edging up here. Did you want to say something?
Well, if you're still open for comment.
I'm still open. Okay, come on.
Thank you. Actually, I was just going to leave you my card, but let me introduce myself. I'm Mike Ricketts. I'm with the County Superintendent's Educational Services Association, and we're the statewide organization that excuse me, represents all 58 county superintendents of schools. And so, first of all, I'd just like to say that as one of the I think crucial layers in the organizational structure that supports our educational system, we're really here to work with you. So I'd like to offer our services, and any information you need or any questions that you've got about the role of county superintendents, I'd be happy to work with your staff and with you, Senator Liu, in providing that information. And I think the one thing I would like to add is that I appreciate many of the comments that were made by the previous presenters. Stefan, when he was talking about the structure, he characterized county offices of education and county superintendents as kind of the catch-all. And in a sense, that's true, because they provide a wide range of services depending on the districts in their county, whether there's a lot of small districts, whether there's a number of large districts. So they have a variety of roles and functions, but I would characterize them more as the glue than the catch-all, because I think they play a crucial role in really kind of binding together this educational system and the governance structure that we have. So I wanted to make that comment, and again, just offer our services if you need them as you go forward.
Appreciate that. Thank you for coming forward. Last one.
Thank you very much, Senator, for your time. Pamela Gibbs for the Los Angeles County Office of Education.
Oh, there you
of
are.
course, in support of Mr. Ricketts' comments as the largest county office of education in the state. And we also want to echo the comments of Sharon Scott Dow, who mentioned the importance of looking at the child and the parent and the student's activity and achievement. For us, we have students who attend juvenile court schools. We want to make sure that we consider the impact of them on any movement or government restructuring that occurs at that level. So again, thank you for your time, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think this concludes the hearing, and thank you very much for your participation.